So I'm late to the whole Dark Souls thing. I didn't really click with the genre until Bloodborne, so I'm missing 2 whole games worth of plot and lore, but I'm also trying to comment on the final third in what is, supposedly anyway, a trilogy. This would be awkward in any context, but this is Dark Souls, where most of the story is told through architecture, flavor text, and vague character dialogue.
Ah, another one roused from the sleep of death. Well, you're not alone. We unkindled are worthless. Can't even die right.
So much is told through architecture and environmental storytelling that a Wikipedia summary just doesn't have the same punch. The point is, I'm not really going to be able to do my normal conversation about the themes and ideas because I'm missing way too much context. And honestly, there are far better and more knowledgeable analyses of these games that already exist. Instead, over the next few weeks, I'm going to poke at a variety of ideas that Dark Souls 3 has caused me to think about since playing it. Consider these essays a non-Dark Souls fan's thoughts on Dark Souls 3. With that out of the way, Dark Souls is renowned for its difficulty, so let's break that concept down and unpack it a little bit. What, if anything, defines this game's difficulty? Well, first the game offers very little forgiveness. Each life you spawn with a handful of flasks to recover health, and aside from a few rare places to heal in the game world, that's about all you get. This makes health a precious resource, and each hit enemies land has consequence. It's not a game that tolerates mistakes, and the sooner you screw up, the more perfect your subsequent actions have to be. Healing damage from trash mobs on the way to the boss means that you have that many fewer flasks for the big fight. Dark Souls also has animation-driven play where swings and slices and parries all need to be played out in full. This is unusual in 2016. Most third-person action games are all about empowerment and tweening between animations quickly based on player inputs to keep a good sense of game feel up. Dark Souls takes the opposite approach. Every swing is completed in full, and if you queue up additional moves, you're committing yourself to doing them, even if you later realize that doing those moves means you're going to be hit. This makes every battle an exercise in last-minute planning. Do you want to commit to your heavy swing in hopes that it finishes off the bad guy before they can land their hit? Or do you instead want to run away and hope that their swing misses you? Or do you want to do nothing just yet and wait until the time is exactly right to dodge? You need to always be looking for tells about which attack is coming next and how to counter it, while also being aware of your surroundings lest you drag other monsters into the fray. Combat here isn't hard in a Twitch skills kind of way, but instead it's sort of a situational analysis and response kind of difficulty. Choosing to dodge too early or swing when you don't have the time to complete your strike can be fatal. This means memorizing all of the enemy's animations to look for tells as to what to do next, and that list is rather extensive. The game also provides a sense of tension by making loss meaningful. First, there's the literal loss of progress. If you die, you respawn at the last bonfire you rested at, which could be 5 or even 10 minutes of careful exploration away from where you died. But more interestingly, as you play, each monster you slay drops souls as a sort of currency. If you die, you drop your entire pile of souls, but you can still return to where you died to collect them. However, if you die again without collecting them, those souls are lost forever. This results in some interesting scenarios where you're carrying a ton of souls but see a giant monster around the corner. Do you want to risk it? Worse, sometimes you will stumble into a boss fight you're not ready for, and then you're locked into a cycle of either trying to go back and get the souls you lost by killing the boss, or doing some additional exploration to level up and potentially losing all those souls. This makes the game hard in the sense that it pushes players to return to areas that beat them, areas that killed them, areas that they found difficult, or else it will erase the things that they've earned. And all of this adds up to a game that feels punishing, harsh, unforgiving. It dumps your progress, it burns your time, it asks for your undivided attention at all times. But the game was never intended to be hard for hard's sake. Speaking to the Metro, game director Hidetaka Miyazaki said, quote, "I personally want my games to be described as satisfying rather than difficult. As a matter of fact, I am aiming at giving players a sense of accomplishment in the use of difficulty." And in that regard, I'd argue the game succeeds. Maybe not as well as it aspires to, but it is definitely able to give a sense of accomplishment, and it draws that sense from its difficulty. It's not a game that's hard because it's sadistic or just likes to see you suffer. Instead, the game revels in presenting something that at first seems insurmountable, but over time makes it not only beatable, but almost easy. Fighting giants and dragons and tree gods in a world where even small monsters pose serious threats can feel impossible, but it isn't. The real trick to Dark Souls, and I think the reason its difficulty is so divisive, is that it's a game about learning. You could make the argument that any game about system mastery is about learning, and that's arguably true, but also arguably kind of reductive. Dark Souls isn't the kind of learning that comes from practice or muscle memory in a way that, say, a fighting game is. Instead, Dark Souls is a series of set pieces that you learn to conquer by encountering them, internalizing them, and then moving on. An ambush may get you once, but then you learn to avoid it. A particularly tough enemy may block you at a bottleneck, but you learn to read its tells and avoid its damage, or you learn to take an alternate route. A group of enemies may seem insurmountable, but clever thinking or picking them off one at a time may help even the odds. You uncover the dead ends, you discover the shortcuts, you memorize the locations of bonfires and ambushes, you find the weak points on bosses. It's a game about learning in that it's a game about getting to know the game's world and inhabitants rather than internalizing its systems and making them part of your muscle memory. And by learning the ins and outs of the game's levels and its monsters, by being able to know the fastest paths, how to avoid danger, and how to deal damage when necessary, these initially impossible tasks get broken down into very manageable checklists and procedures. Armed with the knowledge of where to go, what to avoid, and how to deal with monsters in combat, the game really isn't that hard. But to earn that knowledge, to get to that point where just walking in and beating a boss is feasible, you have to deal with the repetition, the harsh punishments, the wrist slapping that comes with the game's tutelage. Dark Souls' entire philosophy is you will be browbeaten until you understand it. Whether these games work for you or not depends entirely on how you feel about that. Some people balk at the idea of suffering through hours of repeating the same area over and over and over again, measuring progress in inches only to reach a boss that requires an additional hour or two of repeated tries just to unlock the next area and start that process all over. To others, it's a challenge to rise to. Every ambush encountered or attack tell memorized is another tool in the tool belt, another addition to the knowledge bank that is the true source of your power in this game. And there is a tremendous sense of achievement in being able to casually walk through an area that had terrorized you just hours beforehand. Some of it is aided by stat upgrades, sure, but the monsters themselves still pose something of a threat, you just know how to deal with them. It's the video game equivalent of taming the wild, of bringing a feral thing to heal even if it takes time and dedication to do so. So, is Dark Souls hard? Yeah, it is definitely hard, but it's not hard in a way where randomness or outright acts of aimless cruelty drive its difficulty. The game isn't Battletoads. Instead, it's hard like a really ridiculously strict but somewhat fair teacher. I think the game has a reputation for being Pinhead from Hellraiser, a sadomasochist who thinks pleasure and pain are inexorably linked. But really it's more like a Pai Mei from Kill Bill, a teacher who means well but thinks taking out an eye is an appropriate response to disrespect. Both characters really want to hurt you, but one thinks you enjoy it while the other uses it to enforce discipline. All of that strict instruction can feel really rewarding if you're the type to persevere until you've mastered what is asked of you, but all of that relentless disciplining and chastisement also turns a lot of people off the game. I mean, why do you think it took me 4 tries at From Software games to finally stick with one? Dark Souls is hard enough that even people with decent game literacy struggle with it, and there are plenty of people who genuinely cannot make progress. And so we reach the question of, does Dark Souls need an easy mode? The question of whether to open the game up to a wider audience is a decidedly political one in the game space of today. We're not 4 years removed from Jennifer Hepler having to delete her Twitter account because she suggested that players should be able to skip combat scenes the way they can skip cutscenes, and the reactionary gamer crowd responded pretty much how the reactionary gamer crowd responds to everything at this point. But Hepler's point was valid. Games like Dragon's Age or Mass Effect are games that had people interested in their combat gameplay loop and in their narrative systems. If we let players interested in shooting skip or at least minimize the story systems, why not the opposite for people that struggle with or don't care about the shooting? Mass Effect 3 actually did this. The idea of releasing an easy mode for Dark Souls that broadens the game's appeal is noble. Far be it from me to say that accessibility is ever a bad thing. But unlike Mass Effect, there really aren't any other systems to lean on. Mostly, the whole game is just combat. And the problem is it's hard to easyify the combat's core conceit of learning through repeated failure. Like, the game's whole intent is for you to die a lot and learn from that dying, and the goal of making the game easier is to make you not die a lot. They're inherently at odds. Like, look at Doom. All of Doom's difficulties ask you to dodge missiles and shoot monsters, and higher levels of difficulty ask you to dodge more missiles and shoot more monsters. But the core of the game can scale with how difficult it is. But the core of Dark Souls really is dying a bunch to learn how to not die. The reason you remember ambush locations is because they are often fatal or near enough to it. Enemy animations are memorized because miscalculating your response to an attack can be lethal. Player animations don't tween in order to force the player to think about their next move before committing to it, rather than just slamming the attack button repeatedly. If you peel the damage done back down and crank the damage dealt up, the emphasis on that knowledge, hard-earned through 1,000 deaths, fades, and with it would go that sense of accomplishment that Miyazaki is aiming for, of completing a task that at one point felt impossible. And that's just not the game From Software set out to make. Playing in this mode, you'd still get all the vistas and see the enemies and read the background lore, but you'd also be playing a fundamentally different game. That's not to say that an easier mode for Dark Souls can't exist, or that it would be bad, just that it would be different. Different in a way that is existential to what has come to be known as the Dark Souls experience. Ultimately, it's the developers who have to make the call about what that difference means to their game and whether to include easier modes. But Dark Souls, more than most games, makes a compelling argument for its difficulty. It's not system mastery as machismo, and it's not thoughtless mimicking of coin-op or NES difficulty out of blind nostalgia. It has its design goals, and it achieves them, even if it means alienating a lot of its potential audience. One could argue that such a commitment to artistic intent is bold, but then again one could argue the same thing about Pai Mei's teaching style.